So when we look at those abiotic and biotic components in an ecosystem, that's essentially the study of ecology. And we'll be talking about this quite a bit, how the energy from the sun is going, and the biotic organisms in an ecosystem are going to rely on these abiotic components. And there's going to be certain boundaries. So just like any boundary, imagine a fence or a wall, that separates two different areas. But in regards to ecology, it's a little difficult. It's very hard for ecologists to define a certain ecosystem. We could look at a range of wolves, but wolves will roam. And for example, here you have a boundary of Yellowstone National Park. And one of the instances they have, it's hard to study an ecosystem when they have bears that will move in and out of the park area. So ecologists will even use topographic features like mountains or rivers or oceans that separate two ecosystems. And ecosystems can even be as small as water that has fallen from rain into a tree trunk, and this is harboring a life with bacteria and insects and different organisms. So you could even have a small little area as an ecosystem as well. And that's what we're actually doing with your eco columns. Those are actually miniature ecosystems. The other problem is that ecosystem boundaries, they pretty much overlap, especially looking at this transitional zone. You have a lake environment here, and species will be going in between both the aquatic and the land zone. So that another example of why it is so difficult to create these boundaries in ecosystems, because they all rely on each other. And these are called ecotones. So if we take all this together, we're going to keep using that word abiotic and biotic, but we integrate all these things. Essentially, there's this 20-kilometer or 12-mile thick layer around the Earth, which we call the biosphere. And this goes from the highest mountain peak on Earth, the Everest, to the deepest ocean, the Marianas Trench, and that is what creates our biosphere as a whole. So to move on, we need to understand how energy relationships interact, and what ecologists will study is the movement of this energy and matter within an ecosystem. And it's a combination of photosynthesis and respiration. If we take an example like the Serengeti Plain in East Africa, you have the plants that are there absorbing the energy from the sun, using that water, which in turn the wildebeest, the zebras, are taking that energy that was produced by the sun through the plants and are now eaten by those herbivores, which in turn we have this cheetah here waiting, which will eventually prey on one of those animals. So it's this whole system which we're going to look at today. So if an organism uses energy from the sun, we call that an autotroph. That prefix auto, think automatic. It doesn't have to do anything. It's using that energy also along with water and carbon dioxide to create those sugars. And these could be like the tree in this picture, or even think of there's even algae or some bacteria that can do this as well. And make sure we know this equation of photosynthesis. So there's our carbon dioxide, there's our water, signifying the sun's energy used by the chlorophyll, which will create that sugar and then also release oxygen in the process. The opposite is what organisms that cannot perform photosynthesis, which we call respiration. And if you look at it closely, it's just the opposite of photosynthesis. So we are taking that glucose that was created by the plant, inhaling that oxygen, and as a result, breaking it down into chemical energy and releasing carbon dioxide, water, but in turn get ATP, or which we call energy. So again, as I reiterated, look at the relationship between the two. You can't have one without the other. The mouse here giving off CO2 is being consumed by the plant, and vice versa in regards to the oxygen and so on. There's different types of respiration. Our first is aerobic, think air. This is when cells, they need oxygen. They convert that glucose and oxygen, we get our energy. That's what a lot of organisms, especially you and I, use. But there's also the anaerobic. When you see that prefix an, think without. So this would imagine bacteria that live on maybe in mud under a swamp where there's no oxygen at all, they can still perform cellular respiration, but it is important to note that this does not provide as much energy as aerobic. Aerobic provides much more energy than anaerobic respiration. Okay, so we have this energy being produced and it's going up the trophic levels. So what we're going to look at now is how it moves through these levels eventually, and in turn how it ends through decomposers, scavengers, and so on. First, we have our consumers, or we can also call them heterotrophs. These are organisms that cannot produce energy through photosynthesis. They need to consume, they need to get food, and this can be done many different ways. You see the lion obviously eating whatever that was. You have the butterfly, and then even the sea turtle there consuming algae. So this occurs both on terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And we can go even further and look at there's different types of consumers. The first ones we're going to look at are producers. And let's play this video here. This is a time lapse. This was about 5 minutes of a Galapagos tortoise, but you can see this tortoise is a consumer. It is eating the producer, which is in this case the grass. So the energy that the grass gained from the sun is now being consumed by the giant tortoise, which in turn will eventually be used in another life process. If we have a consumer that needs to eat another consumer, we call these carnivores or these meat eaters. And again, we have our aquatic and our terrestrial consumers. And there can be different types of consumers. A secondary consumer, if we look here, this is the case of the lion and the fish. It's a carnivore that eats a primary consumer. So this lion may eventually eat a zebra. The zebra is considered a primary consumer because it is one step away from that producer, in this case, grass. Or if we're going to look at the fish ate the zooplankton, which in turn got its energy from the algae, the photosynthesis, that energy that was produced by the algae. A tertiary, or in this case, think third, tertiary is third, is our bald eagle. So this is a carnivore that is eating a secondary consumer. In this example would have been the fish. So just take a look at those. It's just important not to confuse the two. Secondary comes from the primary consumer, and the tertiary is eating another type of consumer. In regards to scavengers, these are kind of our recyclers or our garbage collectors. Each trophic level is eventually going to produce dead individuals and waste products. And these animals are very important because without them, the world would just fill up with these dead plants and animals. So scavengers like the vultures in this picture are going to consume dead animals. But there's two other types we're going to look at. A detrivore. This is breaking down dead tissue and waste products. So the dung beetle here on the left is a perfect example. A waste product from an animal. Or you have the worm there breaking down tissue as well. And we can go one step further where we have the decomposers, what the worm or the dung beetle did not break down. The decomposers like bacteria or mushrooms or a fungus, will recycle it back into the ecosystem, creating nutrients. So here is our entire system. You can see that this ecosystem in action, they're all relying on one another. But it's extremely important to point out that species in these natural systems are rarely connected in a linear fashion. It's not this, one straight line where the cheetah eats the gazelle, which eats the grass. There's many different interactions, and it's important to illustrate this. It's one of the most important concepts in ecology we need to illustrate, and it's that all species are connected. Not every animal may eat the dung beetle, but the dung beetle is performing a specific role in this ecosystem. And notice the arrows. The arrows are pointing to where the energy is going. So in the case of the grass and the hare, the energy is going from the grass to the hare, and then energy from the hare to the cheetah. So make sure you have understand those arrows and they point to where the energy is going. Some ecosystems, the amount of energy available is determined by how much life the ecosystem can support. So if we look at a lake ecosystem, for example, the amount of sunlight that can penetrate the water of the lake will determine the amount of algae. The amount of algae is going to determine the amount of zooplankton, and the amount of zooplankton is going to determine the number of fish, and this is going to go on and on. So it all begins with how much energy is available at the beginning from the sun. And there's two types of productivity. We can have our gross product productivity. And what we mean by this is that this is the total number of energy. This is you getting your, how much you earn. Let's say you have a job where you, to make numbers easy, you get $100 a month before taxes. So the gross primary productivity is like the amount you'll make before taxes are taken out. This does not include the energy lost because producers as well will respire. And it's important to point out that this is not a very efficient process. If you look down here, 1% of the energy is only captured by photosynthesis, so not a very good return. If we want to look at the net primary, now we are subtracting the amount of energy produced by the producers or the plants. This would be the money you take home after taxes. So the net primary productivity, you're going to subtract respiration from the gross primary productivity. And in this case, it's 40% because we can see that due to respiration of the producers, 60% is lost. And this is, we'll just sum it all up for you, which we just discussed now. So moving on, we're going to look at the efficiency of energy transport. How efficient does energy go from one trophic level to the next? And there's two things we need to distinguish between. First is biomass. Biomass is this total of all living matter in a specific area. But it's not something a little more specific we can look at as the standing crop. And this is at a particular time because it's always going to change. Think seasons change, you get different amounts of solar radiation is going to determine the amount of producers that are there, which in turn will have its domino effect on the line. So standing crop is this amount of biomass at a certain time. Please do not confuse this with productivity. Productivity is the rate of energy production over time. So please don't confuse the two. And when we look at ecological efficiency, it's at any given time, not all energy is in usable forms. And think about that. Not all plant material is digestible. When this fish eats the smaller fish, there's certain things like bones or scales that fish will not be able to digest. And even this fish needs energy from day-to-day activities, which we all know is lost as heat. So ecological efficiencies are fairly low. The average is about 10% across ecosystems. As you go up, you're only gaining 10% of the energy you started with. And this is represented in these trophic pyramids. And these tend to look similar across ecosystems. It doesn't matter. Most biomes, or most of the biomass is coming from the producers at the bottom and will commonly decrease up the pyramid. So keep that in mind as we move through the chapter. And as we move through this chapter, it's important that we apply this lecture on how energy moves through an ecosystem, and we're going to consider how matter moves as well, moving forward, looking at those biogeochemical cycles.